Africa remains split on what stance to take in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Last week, at a UN General Assembly, South Africa was one of the 17 countries that abstained on the vote to condemn Russia's aggression on Ukraine. Now, the adjunct senior lecturer at the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business, Dr. Stephen Quo, says the country's neutral position allows it to be available as a peace facilitator. He joins me now. Dr. Quo, thank you very much for making the time to speak to us. Your opinion piece yesterday, which appeared in the Business Day opinion section, can I just read the headline of that particular piece? You said, neutral stance gives South Africa mediation ability. Now, I'm not sure whether to call you clairvoyant, because you almost called it, Dr. Quo. The President, Cyril Ramaphosa, announcing yesterday that he had had a phone call with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, and at the end of that call, South Africa requested to play a mediating role between the warring countries, Russia and Ukraine. Your reaction to this?
I think it's excellent. I think South Africa does have both the ability, the track record, and I think willingness to play mediator. And remember, to be a mediator, you need to be accepted by both sides, right? So South Africa, being, I suppose, one of the leading countries in the South, in Africa, also with Russia, of course, as part of the BRICS alliance, it's excellent. It's about time that South Africa got in there and tried to help.
I can't resist, Dr. Quo, from asking the question about how this news is possibly being digested by leaders of the Western world. I'm talking EU and the United States, that South Africa is being asked to play this role by a country that is seen as the aggressor in this war.
Well, look, so as we know, Ukraine foreign minister had officially requested the Chinese foreign minister to come and talk. We know that the Ukrainian side and the Russian side have sat down once or twice now to try to talk about the ceasefire. So, look, whether whichever side loses face, that's not important. The important thing is the two sides are sitting down and talking, right? Whatever was said, whatever we can talk about all the problems as we sit down face to face, and there need to be a mediation, there need to be a ceasefire. So whether the West like it or not, whether anybody like it or not, even the Ukrainians themselves want to sit down and talk.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
In the piece, Dr. Quo, you do make mention of the world's second largest or second powerful nation, and that is China, its relations with the EU in particular. And to use your words, you said in that piece that the EU is carefully re-examining its relationship with Russia, with Russia's closest ally. And I've got to ask that question, but flip it into the South African context, and that is that we have possibly the biggest trade relations with the EU versus the trade relations we have with Russia. What does South Africa stand to gain if we do come across on the world stage as being either sympathetic towards Russia?
We already are sympathetic with Russia. Our African National Congress, as everybody knows very well, has a long history where whilst it was a struggle movement in the 60s and 70s, ANC was supported by the Soviet Union. During the Mandela administration, and still today, we have a very good relationship with Cuba, for example, which is seen by the U.S. as is a pariah state. So South Africa, and I've got other examples too. Iran, for example, and interestingly, as the West is talking about cutting oil, buying oil from Russia, the West is not talking to Iran. The West is talking to Venezuela to open the taps. You see, so on the one hand, I have written opinion pieces before criticizing South Africa taking a too radically position against the West, but I think it's well known that South Africa is its own country. South Africa is an African country, it's a country of the South. It's a part of the BRICS. It's not a Western country. And it has for a very long time been trying to stand up for developing countries and countries of the South. So, and South Africa has a right to do that. It doesn't need to agree with the West at every turn and every juncture.
Yeah.
So I don't think the European Union or the West in general is going to give South Africa a hard time for speaking up, for expressing its own opinions on international affairs issues.
Dr. Kwo, you talk about, or you make mention of the word pariah, or the description of a pariah state when you speak in the context of Russia, and you remind me of the words of the U.S. President Joe Biden at the start of this war some 2 weeks ago. And he had this to say, I quote now, that any nation which backs Russia's naked aggression against Ukraine will be stained by association. Putin will be a pariah on the international stage. Is that what South Africa risks?
I don't think so. Look, on the UN General Assembly vote last week, Ethiopia voted against the motion. So Ethiopia is standing along with, not Ethiopia, I beg your pardon, Eritrea. Eritrea voted, along with North Korea and Belarus. Right? So they're openly supporting the Russians. Notice that we are not, South Africa's sort of abstination. We're standing with, for example, China. We're standing, for example, with India, which is the largest democracy in the world. India also took the same position South Africa has. India took the same position that they abstained from the vote and they called for negotiations, right? So if South Africa was going to be painted with the same brush, then President Biden will need to paint India with the same paintbrush. So I don't particularly think South Africa not, as it were, fall in line with the West, immediately make us an enemy of the West. I don't think it's that straightforward. And finally, President Joe Biden has a long history of friendship in one of the anti-apartheid activists backing the supporters, anyhow, back in the 80s and 70s.
Yeah.
So I don't think us not supporting wholeheartedly, if you like, behind the West. And I argued condemning Russia just makes us make us ineligible.
Yeah.
Had we condemned Russia, Ramaphosa would not be eligible to be a peacemaker, to be a facilitator for ceasefire first, and then long-term discussions. So it seems to me that you might have the satisfaction and the pleasure of condemning Russia, but you won't have the practical leverage to be able to sit in the negotiation room. And it seems to me South Africa would rather sit in the negotiation room and be useful rather than not. And I suppose one more thing, as the West openly criticizes Russia, but Ukraine has to fight on its own.
Yeah.
Right? So NATO can't go in. So how much is the West helping? The Ukrainians are also very disappointed by the West. They have all this rhetoric, all this condemnation, but when push comes to shove, Europe still needs Russian oil and gas, and NATO still doesn't, or for, I suppose for good reason, does not want to fight for Ukraine against Russia. So there.
Two quick questions before I let you go. The one has to do with this kind of request that has now come to South Africa by the Russian leader to say, play mediator. Would that, in a way, possibly allow for South Africa to be invited by the UN to become some special envoy of sorts to try and broker peace between these two countries? And if that happens, where would that put South Africa on the world standing or on the global map?
I think it'll be a good thing. Look, so as I mentioned in the beginning, a mediator needs to be acceptable to both sides. In the piece I wrote that Mbeki was a special envoy for the Darfur crisis in 2012. In 2015 or 16, Thabo Mbeki's name was again put forward to be a mediator for the Great Lakes region in the DRC. But this time around, South Africa was seen as not totally neutral. So the belligerents in the Great Lakes region said, no, we don't want President Mbeki to come and mediate. So us not condemning Russia has allowed us, if you like, a ticket to be acceptable to both sides, right? None of the Western nations, and presumably India is similarly going to be has the same ability to be a mediator. India has relatively good relationships with Russia, and South Africa has the history. I mean, given our own history with white minority rule, there is strong mediation capability. Ramaphosa is an excellent mediator. I'm sure the listener all know about his history, negotiating the end of the white minority rule. So it can only be positive for South Africa standing in the world. And Western countries, none of the direct Western countries would be a mediator, as it were, right? Because now Russia would not accept them as a mediator now, because they're fighting on the Ukrainian side. So as a developing country from Africa, we're not partisan, I suppose. We're not partisan or seen as partisan, so we can help. Okay, all right. So let's conclude our conversation. You made the point in your piece that Africa, the nations, the 54 nations of Africa, are divided, though, on which side to stand in this Russia-Ukraine conflict. Does that make us look weak in a way, or do countries like South Africa, who have this, I don't know if you want to call it a fortune, perhaps in your view, because you see it as a good thing, that we being approached to try and play the mediation role, does that put us in good stead, even though the continent as a whole stands divided? Look, the UN Charter, it's about each country having sovereignty and territorial integrity, right? Kenya and Nigeria are entitled to their perspective and their viewpoints, and so is South Africa, so is every single sovereign nation in the United Nations, right? We are all entitled to our viewpoint, right? So the fact that Africa has different voices doesn't mean Africa is weak. I mean, they may. So I don't particularly see that equation in my perspective. So from my perspective, I do think that South Africa, as part of BRICS, which is one of the most important international organizations that South Africa belongs to, as economically we're not the biggest. However, we're able to sit at the top table with the the big powers from different part of the world, the Chinas, the Indias, the Brazils, from each part of the globe. It's excellent for South Africa's prestige on the international stage, and it's consistent with what South Africa's foreign policy is about. It's about Africa having an African voice, South Africa preferably being the leading voice in Africa, and then speaking up on global issues. And at the moment, this is probably the most pressing of global issues. And Africa can now present its viewpoint, and well, South Africa certainly is, and we can contribute to a peaceful globe. That's as I argue, that's a good thing.
Yeah,
I think that's an excellent thing that what we are doing now.
All right. That's Dr. Stephen Quo. Thank you very much for your insights there. He is with the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business.